Hello? Okay. I think.
Ooh, amazing. Yes. All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to this craft session. I don't want to talk very much because you have amazing, beautiful, big brains with so many folds that we will be using here. Maybe we should close the door and welcome folks as they start to roll in. But this craft session it's many things. We are going to do modified Chatham House rules, so please do not attribute, you know the drill, but we will modify them where there is a form at the end. If you do want to opt into authorship, we really greatly appreciate your being here, sharing your thoughts with us, and we want to credit that. So we will have the opportunity to put your name, affiliation for what the ultimate goal is. This is the goal. Of having a V2 report. So we, the organizers here, I'm Irene,
Marie-Therese.
Willie, and Xerox. We also organized a workshop many, many moons ago in autumn where we brought together experts across different sectors to think about what does it mean to assess, evaluate generative AI systems across modalities. At the time, we were thinking about general purpose AI systems inspired by policy and regulation dedicated towards increasingly generalized technologies. We didn't really like that term very much and wanted to get more specific to the system. So we ended up making a framework of evaluating the impacts by the impact by what you can measure in the system and what you can measure in society. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to try not to speak very much so that we can get into our breakout groups. There is a report if you want to QR it, and it's also available at this archive link. The main goal here is, like, if you've ever read these generative AI, like these large language model papers, and they happen to have a social impact section, like we love people doing the bare minimum, it's super messy and like really, there's some people who do an amazing job and I deeply respect that, but what by messy I mean there's no standard set of evals that people use across their different papers. Like there's no real consensus or anything towards a collective idea of how to think about this. We are no authority on what standards mean, but we really want to start to move towards providing some guidance on how to think about these sections, but also guidance to policymakers when they're thinking about what risks and harms are important to people, what tools exist to already evaluate them. And ideally, this will be used by many different groups, many different approaches, and we want to make this as accessible as possible. So we're also collecting evals by the different impact categories. There's a QR code. Everything's also available online. We're happy to share this if you share your email towards the end. Different levels of collaboration, very encouraged. And if you do have evals that you've been thinking about, please share them in the form in this QR code. Again, everything will be accessible later. We talked a little bit about the landscape. The way that people have been approaching, maybe they look at bias, maybe they look at social impact. Like we give a gold star, we're not naming names, but gold star to this paper for really digging into a bunch of different categories. We talked about the different types of AI systems across. We're looking at different modalities. In this workshop, it'd be great to actually zoom into what evals exist by specific modality, where are the gaps. A lot of literature tends to be skewed towards specific modalities. There's a lot more done on language, for example, than on video generation, and how this can be commentary on where we need to put more resourcing into developing evaluations. So I'm like trying to speed through because I really want to hear from you and not from myself. Here are the social impact categories that we found are measurable in a base system. These are not meant to be comprehensive, and part of the feedback that we want here today in a very short breakout is where should we be improving, where are the categories that we're missing that we can start to evaluate in a specific AI system by modality. What has happened so far, I've tried to look at the top AI conferences and what bias evals have been used. This is zooming in on a specific category. We see a lot more in language than we do even in image. Haven't seen a ton for video. And a lot of what we're seeing are like quantification. Would like to zoom in more into the limitations of how do we evaluate something that is so complex and qualitative inherently. So I'm not talking anymore. I'm gonna go back so that we can hear from you. We have put Post-its, giant Post-its around the room. I would love if folks could gravitate towards one of these impact categories. One of these will be online, and I'm gonna claim this guy. This guy's gonna be online so that we can be inclusive of our online participants. Go forth, everybody. We're gonna try to, we might move you if it's unevenly distributed, and we're gonna give you 20 minutes to think through the questions. Here are the questions. It's been a week, y'all. All right, to think through these questions, we're gonna pass out Sharpies, and we're gonna come back in 20 minutes to think about what are the gaps in what evals exist, and how do we make this better? Do you want to? Hi.
I'm SVing for this session, so
Oh, awesome.
they said just go around and make sure everybody has like pens.
Perfect.
Is there anything else?
No, that's great. I want to do like the least as possible as me up here, and I want the brains to do their brain thing, you know? Yeah.
Logan, by the way.
Irene, nice to meet you.
Look around.
Perfect. Hey.
I'm going around.
Oh, awesome.
This one?
We're gonna do that one online.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I know. Maybe would it help to shift y'all so you can read it? Okay. Okay. Perfect. Great. Cool. I mean, hey.
Sir, could I get another sheet as well of paper?
Yeah, of course. Let me figure out where I put that. That's the here we go. Hello? We'll come back in 5 more minutes, y'all. Hi, you are amazing. I have a lot to talk to you about. I love this.
I was gonna say, I love this fit.
Thank you. I want to bring some business casual energy with the tie. I'm Irene. Hi. Nice to meet you.
And I like the tie, like the knit. I have like
Yeah, the
Thank
knit
you.
there's
tie.
some knit ties in my collection.
I
so
know,
it's
I
all
know. I
the
have to
skinny
start.
knit tie.
Yeah, I'm
I have
into
to.
it.
I think I have to wear ties
Yup.
again. Like,
Bring it back.
I just have to like. I think my style I've decided is now from the new. Like, have you watched this new Queer Ultimatum? And his
I
like.
haven't yet. I need to binge
It's so
it.
bad, but the only good person there is Mal. And like
No
who
spoilers.
dresses like
Hey.
is like hot kind of mask, and I was just like getting to sort of
Yeah, mix
like
it. Yeah.
yeah.
I'm actually running a craft session. I was looking for Xerox, but
I just saw him.
okay.
I don't know where.
I'll just call him. It's all good.
Yeah. No, I saw the craft session and I and I liked him.
You're fine. Don't worry about it.
Good meeting you.
It was wonderful to meet you. I will be in the Bay for the next month, and I wanted to talk to you about many things. But okay, it's great to meet you. Bye. Hey there. Hey, we're about to wrap up this breakout session. We're organized by topic area, what's able to be done in the system, and we're doing these breakout questions. But we're going to be back in 2 minutes. Yeah. No, no, nothing to apologize for. All good. I don't know where Xerox is.
Zurich will reappear when he's needed.
But he doesn't know when he's needed.
That's true.
It's an uh-oh situation.
I trust in Zurich too.
I also trust in Xerox. I texted him, so it should be fine.
Yeah.
Word. Choose a juicy juice.
He's okay.
I thought we should not get like too turnt for the craft, but it could be fun.
Like a little turn.
A little.
Juice.
Yay! Shall we? 5:29. Maybe I call him to bring it back in.
Zurich doing the next thing.
Xerox did not want to do any public speaking, so didn't want to pressure him into anything. Ruh-roh. He no answer. Maybe we can run this. Hey, BB, we're coming back. Oh, cool. Ruh-roh. That's not great. Hello. Okay, awesome. All right, we're ready to end this breakout group. I'm going to pass this mic around by group. I know this looks like such fruitful discussions. I'm really just enamored by all of this. And I'm going to bring it over. We're going to go this way is clockwise. And I'm just going to hold this out and somebody's magically going to take it from me.
Hello. I don't know what we're doing, but I've got the mic. We were talking about bias, stereotypes, and representational harms. We decided to ground this a bit by talking about both text-to-image and sort of more standard language modeling. People thought that in both cases you would need to, what we're lacking some sort of generator that takes a set of protected characteristics and generates some media from it and has some assessment from there. People also thought there were gaps, quite big gaps around the small number of benchmarks that do exist. So for instance, we would want benchmarks that were not just on race, religion, or gender. There was some discussion about some recent work from psychology field about categorizing different stigmas. Like I think there was a list of 93 stigmas that people mentioned might be good to generate from, such as infertility was one of them, or even living a child-free life. People wanted less academic data sets, which, I think it is open for corporations to release corporate data sets, but might be hard from a data point of view. People found a lot of things US-centric. People wanted more explicit mapping of stereotypes, for example, to actual harms. So being able to see what harms would result if we get this wrong is an important step, because some things might be stereotyped but not harmful, some things might be harmful but not stereotyped. People wanted, with all these tools, sort of more of a framework for users to report what they saw, because eventually, like, crowdsourcing this will be a source of immense signal. People will understand contextual harms that you might have no idea of as the person designing these systems. People were calling for more automated assessment, specifically of the generated images, because while it's easy to spit out images at the moment, it can be hard to assess them. We don't have like a universal tool for, like, language is easier to assess, basically. And finally, in language, people were mentioning that doing automatic evaluations are quite hard. There's no dominant, consistent framework that's big enough for people to really trust. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So just again, if everybody could just kind of summarize your results for us, kind of an answer to these questions, but of also any like tensions or interesting discussion points came up, and then we'll just go around, like 1 to 2 minute per group. Feel free to have multiple people in your group speak. So now we're going to go to cultural values and sensitive content. Actually, how about let's give each group just 2 minutes to figure out what you're going to say and who's going to say it. So 2 minutes, and then y'all are on deck. All right, everyone. Well, let's all come back together, and let's hear from the cultural values, and sensitive content group on what they have to say about their discussion. So if everybody could bring their attention back to the room, and do y'all have a person you want to take the mic?
All right, thank you for your questions. Hi everyone, we're in the Cultural Values and Sensitive Content group, and we were kind of talking about, what is the definition first of cultural values and sensitive content? We had some discussion about that, but we started wondering about, well, are there things that can be standardized? Are there evaluations that you can standardize, given that there are lots of different, possibly divergent or conflicting cultural values, and the definitions of sensitive content can be different. Some people suggested perhaps starting with something that is universal, and coming up with evaluation practices along that, like child safety or something like that, starting with easier tasks and then moving to harder. But that wasn't like, that was one potential way to look at that. But at the same time, the fact that there was a lot of diversity was very clear. For example, there was the example of perhaps in some cultures, women who wouldn't want their faces to be shown in pictures, or things like that. And we saw that evaluation, perhaps the way that we have been evaluating things is not the only way to do it. Someone suggested perhaps using unstructured and qualitative measurements instead of trying to do everything quantitatively. Somebody else suggested perhaps grounding the harms in the people that were harmed rather than in the action itself. And other people also mentioned how we need to consider the people who were in power running the evaluation or adjudicating the evaluations, all as potential points of divergence, depending on the culture and context.
Thank you. So now we're going to hear from the Privacy and Data Protection Group.
So within privacy and data protection, the two issues that we were mostly thinking about, one is personally identifying information and a lot of issues surrounding this, and the other is copyright infringement. So we were mostly just brainstorming different evals to try to determine if models might know information that we wouldn't want them to know, or if it's possible to elicit information from them that we might not want to be elicited. So one is, can models replicate artists' styles? In the context of an image, this might be like photography. This might be like a painting from an artist. And in terms of text, this might be just like a book that an author wrote, and we wouldn't want a model to reproduce word for word that text, or even like a very close version of it. And we can do like memorization evals maybe, where you start writing the text, or you provide like a very close description of an artwork in the context window, and you see if the model can replicate it like almost exactly, which would basically suggest that the actual artwork or the text is like memorized within the weights. Another thing that we were talking about is so for private information, if you train them on a large corpus of text, you can try to do a lot of data set filtering, but if things slip through, you might want to evaluate the model that you get, like the large language model, to see if it knows corporate proprietary information, medical information, maybe like social security numbers. So there's just like a lot of things that you'd want to check just to make sure that the model doesn't know that information. Another thing is if you're using it for commercial purposes or just for any purposes, if it is taking ideas from, say, research papers, maybe you're using it for a research assistant, does it properly attribute its sources? So if it says something and then you ask it to cite its source, it might hallucinate something, or it might cite its source. And then another question is, if you're using if you're using it as a code generator, and you're maybe using it for a commercial purpose, maybe it's fine if it reproduces someone's GitHub code. But if that GitHub code is under a no commercial use license, does it know that? And if it senses that you're using it for a commercial purpose, can it not use that particular code? And then there's another tension that we thought about of, large language model providers or like generative model providers might want to store data, such as like the prompts that users put in and the responses from the models to track misuse maybe, or like abuse of the models, or maybe they're looking for responses from their models that they would find inappropriate. And there's this tension between wanting to monitor for misuse and models giving harmful responses, and also trying to preserve user privacy. And there's like a trade-off here that needs to be thought about. And then the last thing that we thought about is maybe in the future, people will want to use models to create synthetic data. And this could be good for some purposes, like just to generate more data for tests. But if we are asking models to create large data sets for various purposes, and we want them to kind of like generate things that seem like personally identifying information from like fake people for like scientific research, can we be sure that they're not actually like recreating data from real people, and that this is actually like fake people that they're creating if we've like trained them on information that might include personally identifying information?
Awesome. So now we're going to hear about disparate performance.
So we discussed, disparate performance. We mostly, I'd say, maybe, I don't want to say got hung up, because it was actually, I think, a really subtle and deep conversation around what performance meant for a generative AI system. And we had a few different ideas of what that could mean, and really the evaluations that we thought of, and there were several, were really kind of stuck in what performance meant. And for example, does it mean that if someone asks for a house, then they see a house of their culture? Or does it mean, say, if we ask for an American house versus a Pakistani house, that we're actually going to see what an American house looks like, what a Pakistani house looks like, and so on? Or, extend it out for the particular modality of image. We thought of, at least for image, an example of an evaluation using a really great data set called the Dollar Street data set, which has a pretty good representation among globally, but also in different socioeconomic levels, right, of different household items and what houses look like and things like that, what families look like in general. And then for text, we talked about, for example, some languages that aren't even on the internet, so maybe can't be encoded in Unicode, I think, and how a text-generating system might not work for those, or might work very poorly, or might make assumptions. But really, we kind of dug into what performance means, and how is that different, say, from bias or fairness questions, or social inclusion, cultural inclusion questions, and how it might be different. And there's, in the end, maybe to summarize, it seemed to come down to it being quite vague what these systems are supposed to do versus maybe what we want them to do or what we expect them to do. And actually, performance can mean a lot of different things, and perhaps it is a little bit more on the designers to figure this out or distill this a bit more clearly, what they're supposed to be doing so that they can be evaluated against that.
Awesome. So now we'll hear from people thinking about financial costs.
Okay, so we thought that we should definitely have a very nuanced analysis and really break it down through the AI life cycles, really thinking about the different costs related to the designing of the system, the development of the system, the deployment, and then the monitoring and evaluation. And within each of those categories, to break it down even further to the human level, so literally the question of those at the elite and super high, well-paid versus those that are being exploited, and the lack of pay really in that front, which is different from the question of the physical infrastructure, the hardware itself, and then also the environmental cost. And then within those three values, we thought we need to break it into the present and then the future, because one thing is to design something for tomorrow versus something that you're designing for 7, 8, 9 generations ahead. And so what is the cost-benefit analysis, just in thinking in that regard, and to break that down across all the different categories of the life cycle. And we thought that this was also really important to compare and contrast with everything that's happening with ESG, or environmental social governance, and corporate governance right now. And one of the big problems in that space, which is similar to the AI space, is what are the criteria? What should we use, really? And the debate lies around what do we need in order to identify what to report that is now being required for companies on the environmental side, which is now for the AI side. And then all of this is couched in the whole issue of, what we put as caveats, where, I mean, these systems are enormous, require enormous amounts of data. We have monopolies, so we have to keep that in mind. And then obviously that relates to the fact that, well, there are many who have little resources, and so there's a problem in terms of there are barriers to entry for all of those who are also in this, working in that space. And then at first we thought, well, across modalities, it doesn't really matter, it's agnostic. And then we said, wait a minute, no, it doesn't. Kind of to other points earlier, I mean, especially when you think of text, it's mainly in English. And what about the rest of other different languages? And so just to give a very brief example, we're thinking, well, if you wanted to actually get indigenous languages, you have a whole other set of resources you need to now go and get access to that particular culture, those group of people, and that just trickles down to what we break down in terms of human capital of expertise at large. And so fundamentally, culture missing kind of came up earlier, and the cost of that in and of itself.
Thank you. So closely related, we have environmental costs.
Thank you. Yes, indeed, closely related. I saw that just the ESG was added to our slide. We talked a lot from the start about making the abstract more concrete. Because, in computer science tradition, we tend to think about abstract concepts, and that makes us not evaluate physical impact. And maybe even an economic lens can still remain a little bit in that abstract realm, which fits computer science well, but there's all these real-life physical costs to different kinds of people, which are not abstract. So you can't also abstract that the cost is the same for everybody everywhere in the world, which relates also to the generational aspect. Well, one type of evaluation we thought should be done is what does it cost for whom, and how much is it? How much of an important resource is that? So one aspect of that we talked about was data center location. We tend to see that data centers are positioned where it's cheapest for bigger companies, for example, where labor or physical space is cheaper than in populated Western economies. But this may be using water that is a scarce resource for local populations, and may cost the local population something very, very costly, very close to their livelihood, when the lens of the company is just that it's cheap because it doesn't cost a lot of money, but it costs people their water. Similarly, and this came up only at the end, in the Netherlands, where I'm from, we are building wind farms. Local population thinks that this is being built to get, well, also cheaper, but also cleaner energy for our households. But first, Google lands in the Northeast, where it absorbs almost all the capacity of the wind farm there. Then in the Northwest, it's Microsoft. And a local government learned in time that the wind farm they were planning was to feed a data center by Meta. And because of political resistance, Meta drew out, and I'm very happy about that. But this is the reality. We need clean energy in the Netherlands. And so far, our big wind farms have been feeding. And also, somebody else mentioned that also the water, under climate change, water is getting a scarce resource even in the Netherlands. Farmers cannot grow their crops because there's restrictions on the water they can use, but the water goes into the Microsoft and Google data centers. But then the Netherlands is nothing compared to what it means for people in Santiago, Chile, or in Brazil, where it's the only water that's there, where people have to, well, grow their little food from that goes into Google data centers. So water usage, location of the physical abstraction. Yeah, so we've talked a lot about making the abstract, that in the work on these types of models, the abstract should become more tangible. We talked also about how in this logic of abstraction we think about the increased cost to the environment of going from simpler types of machine learning to the generative machine learning. The impact is really real. It's not just the O number, it's not just the complexity. We talked, what I really liked is in terms of evaluation, we can look at other disciplines. For example, in anthropology, apparently it's yeah. So I really like that there's this notion that when you're doing your research as an anthropologist, you're extracting, and this is what we're doing as well here. And you have to provide. So it's part of the methodology that you provide a justification or an account of what you give back to the community. But you can.
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll just say. I think we got all the way to the end, and just adding a note was, I think we talked, maybe gestured at where things are a little beyond sort of a metric evaluation or sort of a fundamentally different metaphor or different tracing. Like I think we emphasized towards somewhere in the middle this idea of changing metaphors, changing to tracing as opposed to just quantifying, and some of that meant you know, the big thing is that the cloud is a very specific metaphor, and lots of amazing people have been thinking about that, about all that it abstracts away, and there's a bunch of things you can try to do to make that concrete. One is it's not just quantifying carbon emissions, which maybe feels like a layer at the top or after the model, but it's like, where did this come from? Here's sort of the tree leading to where it kind of began, and with that, maybe generative AI is a myth. Because it is not generating, it is sort of extracting and converting, which again comes from community orgs, not myself. And that also, that practice of lineaging comes from like indigenous communities and global south communities that aren't usually part of this more rationalist quantifying culture. And yeah, this anthropological, some subsets of linguistic anthropologists believe in that kind of qualitative, you extract, you must define your contribution back to who you are extracting from. And that is what is a part of valid research. So yeah, there's lots to be said there, but that's an attempt at the very tail end. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I am so in awe of everybody's expertise, and this was supposed to be 3 hours, so I apologize for making this feel rushed. We're going to leave some time at the end to think about these questions. It's a great note to end on, Ria, for this breakout of why are we doing these evaluations and what are these systems? But we're going to, because we are short on time, and I'm also very grateful for Willie being a better moderator than I am, and also organizing these social impact categories, we're going to move on to what is measurable or able to be evaluated in society itself. There are some categories that we felt when we were first putting together this framework, you can't necessarily evaluate people's trust in information in a system, you would have to work with people to understand that, and there's a whole lot of considerations there. We've put up Post-its for these overarching categories that have a subtitle underneath them for the subcategories. These are in green. We'll also be taking pictures of these amazing Post-its that y'all have written out. We will be deleting that in a month, and again, we really want to recognize and attribute your contributions. So we will have time for a form where you can opt into co-authorship here. So we're going to give you another 20 minutes, and as Willie is so much better than I am to put that qualifier of please think about how you're going to report back, and really excited to hear from your amazing thoughts. Gather. Oh yeah, if you can't see them, we're the 5 categories are trustworthiness and autonomy, inequality, marginalization, and violence, concentration of authority, labor and creativity, and ecosystem and environment. And then there are subcategories within each. So for trustworthiness, you'd maybe think trust in media and information and privacy. And inequality and marginalization, we're thinking community erasure, abusive or violent content, and concentration of authority, militarization, and imposing norms and values. In labor and creativity, thinking intellectual property, economy and labor impacts, and ecosystem and environment, thinking widening resource gaps such as compute and environmental impacts. We have like no time. It's 6 o'clock already. 6:30. I know. Hi. What's able to be evaluated from people in society versus the system. Like carbon emissions and how to switch over. But also we also put widening resource gaps. So, for example, like huge disparate gaps between academia and industry. Yeah. Yep, that would be helpful. And the breakout questions are now on the slides. We'll do another 10 more minutes. Two more minutes.
Hello? Ooh, okay. Is this working? No. Am I just hearing myself? Okay.
Excuse me, can you all turn that microphone on? One thing before me.
Awesome. All right, we're going to bring it back. And I'm going to hand this microphone to my amazing co-lead.
So we were looking at ecosystems and the environment. And so in terms of evaluations, we're thinking about what does it look like, again, to look from a life cycle perspective, a life cycles analysis from inception to deployment, and moving beyond a focus on large language models, but to audio and imagery, and thinking about different evaluations based on modality regarding resource use. There's also an over-focus on corpuses and NLP methods, and we need to think beyond carbon emissions of machine learning models and look at more the physical supply chain. But also there was a comment on there are no comparative analyses once you use these kind of evaluations like code carbon, and the onus is on the engineers and not decision makers at a sort of senior leadership corporate level. Oh yeah, and there's a question on when to deploy large or small models or not. This idea of over-engineering also has an impact on the environment, and it connects to this community called computing within limits. So thinking about what does it mean to do computer science with an understanding that we live within planetary limits. So an understanding that our internet runs on fossil fuel energy. So yeah, over-engineering is a concern. Yeah, the question of greenwashing in industry is also something we spoke about. The application of these models on fossil fuel discovery, which will be very lucrative, and there's been observations that there's more roles appearing at the intersection of machine learning and the fossil fuel industry. Under that, there's also this idea that companies can use carbon credits to claim carbon neutrality and purchasing these renewable energy credits, which is just another way of greenwashing. And then from a standards perspective, for example, within the IEEE, there's sustainable software engineering standards and practices, and that hasn't really featured in the sort of industry standards, especially in North America. And so it's kind of this question or curiosity whether it's a geographic issue and not necessarily that there is like technical incommensurability between these standards and what's happening currently in generative AI. But more of sort of a social and geographic siloing, so those communities should talk more to one another. And then looking to what's happening in Europe with regulatory standards or policies that are relevant to this conversation, kind of these movements around the right to repair, which pushes back against planned obsolescence. There's also the Net Zero Industry Act, there's the CHIPS Act, there's the Critical Minerals Act, and so how can that come into conversation with this conversation we're having around generative AI? And then lastly, concerns around emergent behaviors from the use of large language models, sort of concerns around labor or power centralization, and what does it mean that we kind of will begin to default to using these sort of billion parameter models for that are very resource expensive for more sort of banal tasks that don't necessarily need these technologies.
Thank you. All right, cool. What's up, y'all? We talked about, in our group, concentration of authority. I'm gonna put my little cup down. Yeah, so with respect to generative modeling, so there are a couple kind of sub-points here: militarization, surveillance, weaponization, imposing norms and values that we were just having a little mini salon about. We were wondering, what does this look like? And so far, the things and the ways that we see this taking place are, for the first part, understanding that there's a misalignment of incentives around having broader social like social care incentives versus, say, if we think about even in the context of, you know, anything that's around like militarization, there is this protection of one's asset or like intellectual property. We even went into like the specific example of like military literally using any form of like AI, inclusive of generative AI, for the purpose of national security, and we see and have seen that be of like utmost importance to those specific entities versus you know, these other initiatives that we have going on to include various marginalized groups in giving them more power to say how they show up in these data sets and in the generative AI space. Second thing we saw was also that corporate authority, with respect to corporate authority, they're the ones to set standards, right? For example, we know that, and this is a really good point by Elliot, right? Your name's Elliot? You made a really good point. Elliot was like, you know what? We don't see the probability distribution anymore. And I'm like, that's a really good point. And Francine was like, this is for Francine's beautiful handwriting. You know, that's a really good point too. It's like, you know, now if we think about the ways that the concentration of authority happens with respect to generative AI is that we see that now we hone in on the API specifically. On one side, in the usage of the API, less and less information about the probability distribution, and to your point, that, you know, so that people are prevented from, or like stopped from using that to do some kind of knowledge distillation or to build their own ChatGPT, for example. The third way we see concentration of power is also in, coming back to the APIs, you know, we have examples that we've seen in the past, right? Like, for example, with Meta preventing journalists from using APIs to query their systems and understand how personalized advertisements work. And so this is, I think, a very key part around, a very key part in what we think is now kind of the second question of like, what does it mean to subvert these concentrations, and what does it mean to kind of redistribute power? We come to some place, right, in between understanding like disassembling authority, it takes place via transparency. To be transparent is to share power among other people, and I think we're moving very much understand that like if it's felt like we've moved backwards from more democratic access. And so moving towards more transparent APIs that allow one to query these systems so that we can now start questioning and registering that feedback is a way to kind of like redistribute that authority and power. So yeah, that's what we talked about. Give us the probability distribution. You know, that's right. And kudos to data journalists that like knowing how the APIs are like being throttled and also like terms of service changing. Like that was a brilliant piece. I think it was by Wash Post. Like I might be screwing this up. But like with TikTok, TikTok's like, anyone checked out their API? Do they have one? I'm not sure. But you know, like I think we need to be inspired a lot by data journalists, honestly. I mean, especially with their work around like understanding the language taking place. Like that brilliant visualization coming out of Washington Post also was like, here's the data that people are training on. We were like, whoa, we should learn from you. Yes, let's continue learning from them. Anyways, I'm done.
Okay, so we were talking about a few different things. One is trust in media and information. A second one is over-reliance on model outputs. And a third is personal privacy and sense of self. So we just kind of have a lot of thoughts listed up here related to these three ideas. One is we were thinking with respect to like trust in media, you can, like one thing you can do is you can just evaluate the truthfulness of models that we're training, which is something that we should consistently get in the habit of doing. And I think there are like, we're getting better like evaluations for evaluating truthfulness. Like Truthful QA is one that I think is like pretty good and used across a wide range of models. But we also have to evaluate human interactions with models and how humans respond to models, because when we're evaluating truthfulness, we're not only concerned with how truthful the model generally is, but just how trusting the human is of the model. And in general, are humans becoming less trusting of the media, or is the media becoming less trustworthy because models are either generating more falsehoods that are then in the media, or humans have the concern that models are generating more falsehoods and are just generally more skeptical of media. Also, so for over-reliance on outputs, it's also like, it's kind of similar to this media case where you can't just evaluate the model, but your evaluations need to focus on human interactions with the models. So for over-reliance evaluations, you can do like controlled user studies in certain contexts and see how people respond to like models and like if they quickly become over-reliant on them, and if this is like something, if the model is capable enough for the human to become over-reliant on the model, like if it can at least appear to be doing the task in a way that gains the user's trust. And then also doing real-world observations of, we have these foundation models that are being deployed and they're used in many downstream applications. Is there a general increase in over-reliance on these models as they're becoming used for many applications? So this is kind of going over to sense of self now, is sycophancy is one concern with models where, and this can also go for like media and information, is there's been some evidence that large models often appeal to the preferences of the people who are using them, or like if a user of a model is like clearly has certain political beliefs, the model will often reflect those political beliefs back to them to try to get higher reward, which, yeah, just decreases trust overall and decreases accuracy. And there's also some papers that talk about how models can shift user preferences over time to try to make users more predictable. So we might see models like consistently trying to make users have more extreme political beliefs, for example, which is just, yeah, quite poor for the media situation and just trusted information. But this can make users more predictable, which can lead models to get higher accuracy. Another thing is just, we're outsourcing many things that are just traditionally things that humans do, just communicating with each other. If we have models that are sending emails or drafting emails, this is just going to have a lot of effects on like relationships that people have with one another, and just something that we have to be aware of like what do we want to automate and let models do? Where do we want to let them be taking over functions that are traditionally preserved for humans? Back to like the media situation is just deepfakes will be getting better, and a lot more articles will be generated by models, and we can try to identify when things are generated by models, but we can't necessarily trust that everyone in every context will write when, like, for example, their media article was written by a model. So watermarking, if things like this can work well, could be good solutions, and it would be good if these were widespread practices across industry. And then also, with misinformation in media, often there's not necessarily like a ground truth on political matters, and misinformation, whether something is misinformation, might be better determined by the community overall instead of a particular individual or a particular algorithm. So crowdsourcing to determine if something is misinformation, just having a lot of people read an article, share their thoughts on whether something might be misinformation or whether it should be treated as such, and getting in the habit of evaluating misinformation from like a community perspective, and not necessarily trusting like one algorithm to do this.
You're right there. I forgot that you were so close.
Cool. So I was a part of the Inequality, Marginalization, and Violence group, and we kind of had trouble connecting our topic to the questions, so we spent a lot of our time orienting our whole group with why we came to this topic. And our lenses included queer mental health, imperialism, and colonization of AI, embracing global perspectives, and also including values that are non-Western, and also, more importantly, hate speech as well. And when tackling the questions based on these different lenses of communities that are marginalized and how generative AI can play a role in this, the main actors we identified were first governments and countries, and there's kind of a dichotomy between Western versus non-Western countries, who is imposed upon and who does the imposing. Then secondly, we have companies, the tech companies who are actually creating these products and publishing them or pushing them out. And then more importantly, finally, all the marginalized populations who are most likely impacted by these technologies. And then the next part, the vectors of action. We approach this by picking out certain values or restrictions or perspectives that these actors come from. So a lot of times in hate speech, there's stereotypes, stereotypical language, also in values. And then for companies, a big thing is money and moving fast and breaking things. And then also in terms of how governments interact with this, the idea of maintaining state power and maintaining state values from a Western country perspective can lead to further inequality and marginalization. And also important idea that we could discuss more is the idea of shame, which is more connected to the companies and how they interact with inequality and violence, how public shaming or the fear of being shamed or canceled, I guess, also impacts how they act and move in regards to inequality. And we also came up with a non-vector, so an idea that actors try to avoid touching at all, and that's the idea of protected classes or groups, and how completely closing that conversation and how generative AI is considered can also be a really interesting tension, that the idea of excluding as a form of protection, what are the costs and benefits of that. And then finally, we have some non-actors that even though we first mentioned that marginalized populations are actors, they're usually regarded as non-actors, and how these technologies are deployed. So it's usually the work of these communities that allowed them to have a voice and seat at the table. Also, the prevalence of populations who are not online. So whether it's their elders or people in low access areas, how are they able to have a say, and how are they further marginalized and not brought into the conversation? And then that's also related to colonized populations as well, who's being imposed upon, and how that further leads to violence and marginalization. But yeah, I don't know if anyone else in the group want to add anything, but okay.
Okay, so we're technically at time, so we're not going to have time to do a round or like a plenary discussion unless people want to stay longer, but I don't think you do. So
Real left. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, so we talked about labor and creativity. I think the first thing we answered was like what kind of actors are involved. So we initially had like laborers, employers, and then government, which has the function of like regulation or governing, but then also we brought up this interesting distinction between, Ria's right here, between laborers and artists, and like how people create art for themselves, and then they have to kind of profit off of the art in order to survive. And then that kind of went into like a conversation about like Marxism and like how that kind of fits, how all this fits into that. So we were thinking about like, particular ways of evaluating creativity and how these already exist, like auctions, album sales, critics, and how people don't get fairly compensated for their work right now, hence like the WGA strikes, terrible working conditions for comic writers and for video game creators. And this kind of introduction of these large generative models is just another kind of reification and reinforcement of a lot of these capitalist values where people own the means of production, the capitalists, the people in charge of these like record companies, et cetera, and then they just capitalize on the creativity of people who are trying to survive off of their art, which they're making for themselves. We also talked about intellectual property, things like how people are not truthfully told like what they're consenting to when they try to make money off of their art, like how it's going to be distributed, what function it's going to serve. And then I think another really great point was about thinking about the way that we view the labor market. In particular, people like in the Wall Street Journal, for example, just are like, oh yeah, this model is inevitably introduced into the market, and how is this going to affect, like which jobs are going to get lost, which jobs are going to be introduced. But that's such a like capitalist-centric view of like, when I say capitalist, I mean like the people who own like companies and things like that. Like we're not talking about organizing unions or how that's going to change. Like what happens if the WGA strikes succeed, and what do workers want? Ultimately, again, going back to that previous point about looking at organized efforts, looking at the ways in which creativity is exploited, we've seen this happen over and over again throughout history, and if we're missing like the unionization efforts, historical context, we're not really taking a critical lens into like what it means to be evaluating creativity or exploiting creativity.
Right, okay, so we're done. Or like, do people want to stay an extra 5 minutes to have a discussion about what's going on? I will. But if people don't, there's a forum there if you want to contribute. That we would love to have more people to work with. It would be great if we could make this author list longer than some of the other shit that we see, of people trying to do some good, in contrast to a lot of the other shit we see. So please fill that out. We will facilitate that later via email and so on. But do people want to stay here for like another 5-ish minutes? Hands up for the people who do, hands down for the people who don't. Okay, I see a very clear majority of people who do not want to stay, which is fine. The people who want to stay, we can do this informally, or yeah, you can stay. The rest of you can leave. It's fine. We won't get upset.